welcome to Block and Build, a podcast from Convergence Magazine. I'm your host and the publisher of Convergence, Caden Mock. On this show, we're building a roadmap for the movement that's working to block the impacts of rising authoritarianism while building the strength and resilience of the broad front that we need to win. This week on the show, I'm joined by the host and the creator of The Hum, Saul Levin. The Hum is a new podcast available on all platforms about who controls the future, featuring interviews with the people who are fighting the march of AI and data centers into every aspect of our lives. The show features the stories of people from all over the country who are pushing back against data center development in their communities. We'll discuss the show and what Saul is learning about the AI data center movement through its production. But first, of course, these headlines. The city of Gary, Indiana, saw power wiped out for tens of thousands of residents during a massive storm front that ripped through the region on August 11th. As of this recording, Monday, August 24th, over 17,000 residents are still without power. To save you the math, that is 14 days and counting without power in a city that's just over an hour drive from Chicago. The city happens to also be home to a nearly 80% Black population, which has drawn some sharp criticism from civil rights leaders, including Bernice King, daughter of Martin Luther King Jr., who summed the situation up quite succinctly, stating that, quote, Black communities have too often been expected to endure conditions that would be treated as intolerable somewhere else. It's also worth noting that on the same day that power went out, NiSource Incorporated, the parent company to local power provider NIPSCO, announced that it would be paying out $140 million in dividends to its shareholders. Good for them, I guess. In the meantime, thousands of residents of Gary have had to seek shelter and food distribution from local distribution centers, while schools and businesses remain closed. Something we're also clocking recently are the many ways that some of the classic pillars of support for an administration with a trifecta majority are eroding, and in a way that feels like faster than ever, especially 2 months out from this make-or-break midterm election. Many of those pillars of support, like the business community, the military, and others, aren't the usual suspects as allies for social movements, but that's what makes this an interesting strategic opportunity. Here are just a couple of the many data points that I've been tracking this past week alone. Trump's foolish trade war with Canada, which I think is a little hard to understand. As someone who grew up in the Detroit area and who lived literally a bicycle ride across the bridge to Canada in Western New York, I know a lot of people who aren't exactly movement folks who see this as outrageous grandstanding. And the USS Abraham Lincoln, which is finally headed back to port after a record deployment of over 9 months at sea, is the source of a lot of consternation in the military and veteran communities. The breakdown in conditions on board the ship and other aircraft carriers have led to increased scrutiny of the Navy and the Department of Defense more broadly at a time when Congress is writing a blank check for a blatantly illegal war of choice. I'm not saying that all these folks are yours specifically to organize, but this is an opening for people close to those communities to bring them into a broader front to topple this regime.
Hey everybody, this is Maurice Mitchell, National Director of the Working Families Party. I read and give to Convergence because it has become a home for me to engage in critical analysis, find practical advice for organizing and strategy, and inspiration in the belief that a better world is not only possible, we can build it.
To make either a one-time donation or become a sustaining member, visit convergencemag.com/donate. You can find a direct link in the show notes. Thanks for listening.
We've explored how organizing against data centers has become a unifying rallying point that breaks through this country's typical red versus blue dynamic. In urban cores and rural farm communities alike, serious organizing is happening to stop or slow the rapid development of these facilities at the local and state level as tech companies massively scale up development to feed generative AI and large language models while polluting communities and skyrocketing consumer energy bills. My guest today is Saul Levin, a longtime organizer who saw something fascinating in the diverse and complex experiences and backgrounds of the organizers who were taking on this work. He wanted to go deep with the people from around the country, zooming in and platforming their personal stories. The result is his fantastic new podcast, The Hum, which has published its first series of episodes this summer, with more coming next month. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts. I spoke recently with Saul about the show, as well as what he's learning about the movement against data centers and the corporations forcing them on our communities. Take a listen. Saul, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, super happy to be here. Thank you.
Totally. So tell our listeners a little bit about your new show, The Hum. How did the show come to be, and what is the personal background that kind of got you interested in exploring anti-data center organizing?
Yeah, so The Hum is a new podcast where we talk to people who are involved in the fight against AI data centers. And we try and capture why people are fighting back and concerned about these projects, and also what's motivating them personally, and then what they're doing about it. And it's been a really interesting project so far. We're 10 episodes into the show. We wanted something that would both amplify these fights, which are happening in all 50 states with all kinds of different people. And it seems really important for folks to know about the magnitude of the build out of AI data centers, and also how much people are resisting and how effective they are. And we also wanted to give tools and information to other folks who are trying to understand this problem that's, constantly on the front page of almost every major newspaper and is getting a lot of play, but the perspective of activists and folks on the ground is left out or cut to half a sentence in most media outlets. And we wanted people to be able to say, spend 30 minutes talking about it in their own voice. So that's what the show is. My background is in labor organizing and climate organizing. I came to where I am right now. I spent almost 3 years as the political and campaigns director at the Green New Deal Network, and before that, I worked on Capitol Hill for about 3 years. First for Congresswoman Deb Haaland, who was the first Indigenous woman elected to the U.S. Congress, and then for Congresswoman Cori Bush, who needs no introduction, was my boss for a number of years. And with a handful of friends on Capitol Hill, I co-founded and helped lead the Congressional Workers Union, and we unionized office after office to get people better pay and treatment on the Hill. So I have a background in both of those issues, but also I'm trained as an urban planner. And so a lot of the fights about AI data centers are about zoning and about who gets to put what where and who it's for. And that's what urban planning is all about. So both in my academic background and in my professional experience, it sort of came crashing down on this issue. And I'm a Michigander, so I grew up in Michigan. I got involved in this issue earlier than most because I learned that Governor Gretchen Whitmer was signing deals to give massive tax breaks and abatements and infinite amounts of Great Lakes water to the richest companies in the world. And people were calling me about it and saying, "Have you seen this? This seems really bad." And so I got in quite early. The podcast started because I was talking to people fighting AI data centers, and they were telling me unbelievably remarkable and inspiring stories. And I called a friend and I was like, "Yo, we should record these conversations." So it actually was conversations that were happening anyways become a podcast, instead of like, "Oh, we want to start a podcast. What should it be about?" Because we didn't really, but we thought other people might want to hear those stories.
Yeah, totally. Longtime listeners of this show will also remember that we talked to Michelle Martinez, Molly Sweeney, and Christy McGillivray some time ago about exactly that issue. That, gosh, this was back in the winter, about the ways that the Democratic trifecta in Michigan is doing all these giveaways to basically the AI and data, like big data industries. Speaking of the sort of really compelling stories that you're hearing, I'm really curious what you kind of see. What is the break point that has like launched this into kind of like our mainstream awareness? We're starting to see a lot more coverage of pushback in like sort of like mainstream local news, in the national mainstream news. But I'm curious what you see as the sort of like catalyst that took this movement from a sort of like simmer to a boil.
The catalyst, from my perspective, after doing many interviews and talking to people in dozens of different states, is actually just how bad these deals are. I
Mm.
mean, basically, every organizer or regular person that you talk to about why they're fighting or concerned about AI data centers has a different answer. But all of them have to do with a loss of control of our lives that are being taken over and increasingly dictated by a small handful of billionaires in Silicon Valley and Mar-a-Lago and a couple other places. And people are tired of it. So to me, how shitty the deal is, if you will, is the reason that so many people are involved. I talked to someone last week who got involved because he takes his kids to the zoo in Nashville, and he doesn't every week, and he doesn't want that experience that his kids love and look forward to be ruined by having an AI data center right next to it that's going to bother the animals, bother them when they go there, potentially make the air polluted for his kids. Then the next day after that conversation, I talked to a woman who's an organizer with Mormons for Trump, and she's very conservative and she hates AI data centers. she said, I was a trad wife before it was cool, and I said, well, not everyone thinks of it as cool, but I appreciate that. And, it was really wonderful and interesting talking to her. And she was like, as a Mormon, like I wrote my reading of Revelations and different pieces of scripture actually, suggest to me that this is like a second coming of the beast. Like this is religiously problematic.
That's
So
wild.
those are two completely different answers, and neither of those is the most popular reason to hate AI data centers, which is higher utility bills,
Yep.
massive consumption of water, and public tax dollars going towards companies that have plenty of money to pay for things themselves. So I think how bad these deals are, that there's 20, 25 different reasons that all kinds of different people could say this sucks, is actually what's driving the tremendous and inspiring opposition.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I think that like this question about like what people's entry points are is such a fascinating and like in a lot of ways instructive lesson in kind of where we are politically and like how people feel about other people making decisions about stuff that's going to impact their lives without their input or sometimes even knowledge. And it feels like there's a way in which this issue is like a little bit of a political bellwether. And like, as you point out, there's this way that it is cutting across kind of like traditional political lines. And I'm curious about that dynamic in terms of like people being able to win campaigns against whether it is policy issues, whether it's about a specific data center build. What are the kind of like battle lines that you're seeing in these different communities, and like how are people able to come together across difference to fight this fight?
Data center organizers have been doing something much more effectively than most movements I've ever participated in, which is they're focusing on what they have in common. People are coming together and they're like, I hate your politics. I don't even like what your yard looks like. We don't get along on the PTA. However, we both hate the data center and we're just going to focus on that part. And again, I hear about coalitions of wildly different people who are like, you know what? We found something we agree on. This is not cool and we don't want it. So I think the fault lines are starting in a place where this is a bad deal. And no matter what reason that people recognize that for, they're recognizing that this is part of something bigger and coming together, which is remarkable. The other thing is that why is a bad deal happening in so many places?
Mm-hmm.
The answer is the tremendous economic inequality in our country and the lack of regulations and basic rules. And so when people are pushing for moratoriums and regulations and all these different things, they're saying, well, actually, it's not even that we don't want an AI data center. How could you say you want something that you have no information about? There's no rules about companies reporting water and electricity use. There's no rules governing whether the public has input on building of transmission lines in people's yards. There's no environmental regulations coming down from the EPA, who are actually being told to look away by Trump on gravel falling out of trucks on the way or new fossil fuel plants being built. And so people are looking at this and saying, A, let's come together because we all agree this is a bad deal. But B, the terms of this deal make it such that we could never know or see it being a good deal in the current context. And so people are pushing for moratoriums to slow down because they're like, we're on our back foot against the richest companies in the world. A moratorium buys us time to say, hold on a second, how can we make this system fair?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it seems like that, like creating those longer timelines also then creates the opportunity to do the organizing to like build greater unity amongst people who might otherwise not see eye to eye on all this stuff.
100%. The pattern we were seeing originally was that people are fighting for moratoriums and bans, like, please stop doing this, essentially. Now we're seeing people who are pushing through moratoriums that also have language on zoning regulations, sound ordinances, and different things to say, hey, not only are we putting a moratorium, we're saying whenever this expires, you're only going to be able to build data centers in places that are not on top of residential communities, that are not in places where we want public housing or public parks. And you're actually going to need to build them in commercial and industrial zones that aren't going to ruin people's lives. So the movement is rapidly maturing in the way that it's developing, and it's pretty unbelievable.
I think one of the things that I always wonder is about how a movement like this doesn't just sort of devolve into NIMBYism, and like how do we build solidarities that ensure that like the next community down that maybe is less organized or has less political clout because they're poorer, because they're browner, because they're blacker, doesn't get stuck with the data center in their backyard. Are folks thinking about this? Are folks thinking about like navigating that tension between we want this stuff to have to be sticky and like prevent the bad projects from being built and prevent the bad deals from going through, while also like ensuring that our neighbors then don't have to fight the same fight 6, 9, 12 months from now?
Yeah, people are talking about that a lot. I mean, in a coalition this big and broad, there are people who do see themselves in more of like a NIMBY camp and do see themselves in different like environmental justice camps fighting, white supremacy. Like those folks are all kind of connected in this tent in new ways. But Kaden, let's think about this for a second as a non-local issue in the
Mhm.
sense that if you stop an AI data center in Virginia, someone might say, well, that's likely to come to Washington, D.C., which is the more heavily black community. Some places are lower income. They'll try and put it there next door. Well, we're all on the same grid. So people in Washington, D.C. have been paying dramatically higher utility bills. And Pepco says this is because of our AI data center build out in Virginia and Maryland. Last I
Mhm.
checked, there wasn't a single AI data center in Washington, D.C., and we're still, folks who live there are still facing the consequences of that problem. So I think it's really important to say, like, part of the win is the 6 to 9 month slowdown. And then people are starting to look at how do we build this out so that it doesn't harm people later. But it's not a loss for a community if the community next door kills a data center project or wins a moratorium. It's actually the setting of an example in the cornerstone of broader solidarity and resistance.
Yeah, that's a really helpful reframe, because I think that like the interconnectedness of everything is one of the things that I've found really fascinating about this storyline in particular, and like thinking about the ways that also people's outrage, like this has become a sort of like a useful container for people's overall outrage about generative AI being pushed down our throats basically everywhere you go online, which is like it feels like we're in this moment where the sort of myth of the cloud being this like diffuse sunshine driven technology miracle is being undermined by the fact that like these dirty bad deals are being made in folks backyards to make the quote unquote cloud real. And like that also feels like part of why this is such a great organizing opportunity. In a lot of ways, what you're saying about what like a win for one community being a win for another community sort of like highlights that for me, that it's like so much of Silicon Valley and big tech have been trying to tell us that their services are these sort of like magic things, when in reality they have this very material like infrastructure that is physical and has real consequences.
Yeah. One of the things that we've been talking about a lot is how much data centers and AI data centers are a physical manifestation of so many of the things that everyone is upset about in our society right now. It's so we are losing control over some of the basic things like children's safety when they're using online platforms, or whether they even get to choose in school if they're using online platforms. We're losing control over what it looks like to actually go through your day-to-day life, because all these companies are forcing um, AI into every possible app that we use. And I think that these data centers represent that to people, whichever of these things that they're upset about. And they're like, oh man, this absolutely blows. Like, this is the place that sucks. And we can reach out and touch it because people are, whatever their politics or identity or age, everyone can feel that these companies are, trying to, with help from the Trump administration, to create a new Gilded Age. And we don't want that. We want to have basic liberties and self-determination. So it's a very concrete thing to go to a data center and protest it. I think for people, it's very
Totally.
visceral.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the stories that you've been hearing from folks. The things that I'm seeing in more mainstream media are like, oh, look at these sort of like new Luddites who like don't give a shit about technology or whatever. What are some of the like more surprising or kind of insightful things that you've heard from folks that really like highlight how ordinary people are thinking critically about this issue?
One thing that I'll highlight is a story that I heard on, that's on the podcast, The Hum, from Councilman Chaban from the Seminole Nation in Oklahoma. This is an elder in the community who's on the council. He introduced the legislation or resolution that passed 24-0 to ban AI data centers and generative AI on Seminole territory in Oklahoma. And I was like, hey, man, like, do you hate AI? Are you upset about something specific? How are you doing this? And he was like, Saul, this is a challenge to our very cultural foundations
Mm.
because these companies are trying to steal our language and then plug it into machines. Of course, they've never offered to pay us or for us to correct it. And so they're actually producing a product that's incorrectly sharing the language that we use in our community. And so they're threatening to at the same time steal and erase our language. And on top of that, they're trying to get this machine to replace the role of elders in our community and oral traditions of passing on our beautiful language and culture that we've spent so many generations honing. And he said, but there's something else. What Shaban said was that he actually didn't even want to talk about this stuff.
Mm.
Because I said, well, why did you guys ban it instead of a moratorium and wait till, you even out things and make reporting requirements? What's the difference? And he said, well, we actually have a lot of challenges in our community. We're thinking about community centers. We're thinking about getting healthy food to kids in schools. We have real problems. And if we spend the council meetings for the next 6 months or 4 years talking about AI data centers that none of us were thinking about, worried about, or interested in, we're actually just wasting our time. It's just a waste of time because we have real things to do. And then, I got to say, to honor Reverend Shaban, that he said, I don't want to do violence to my customs. And like, we don't really think about time as being wasted in the way that, Americans do generally.
Yeah.
But he said, we have things that we think are much higher on the ladder, and actually going back and forth about this in and of itself is not what we're interested in doing to make the lives of the people who live here better. I thought that was really profound. It's like, Kaden, why are we talking about this right now? This was forced on us. We didn't. You host a podcast, you do all this amazing writing and editing. You have things to do in your life. You never said, oh, can these big tech companies expand their footprint and power it with ugly, gargantuan, fossil fuel consuming rectangles that are placed right next to residential structures all across this country? Like, this is preposterous that we even have to have these conversations. And people like Chaban zooming out and saying, we should actually be making our own decisions about what we spend our time on. I found very humbling and inspiring. So that's one story. I'm happy to tell more if that's helpful too.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's just so rich in that one. It's like, I do think having somebody zoom out like that for you and be like, no, like, I do think that a lot of the leaders of these big tech companies assume that they can set the terms of the debate. So much of the way in which they've gotten used to being not just the sort of producers of technology, whatever that means, but also the producers of culture. And then like pointing at, this is not just about what we don't want, but it is about what we do want. And what we want is like good schools. What we want is nutrition for our children. What we want is healthcare. Is like such a useful reframe that puts our attention back on the thing that really matters. The thing that I am massively obsessed with is the issue of the attention economy. And so much of the attention economy is governed by the sort of tech oligarchs, whether directly through the algorithm or indirectly in the way that you're talking about here, which I think is really interesting.
There's so many stories here, but another thing that stands out to me is what's motivating people to organize is so variable. And we talked about folks coming together, but the starting point is really interesting because organizers and, communities fighting back are always talking about how do we reach more people. And one of the big questions about AI data centers, like where did all these people come from who have never been politically active before, and now they're spending all their time fighting these projects? Well, one woman I talked to named Lorraine in North Carolina, she lives in rural North Carolina. We had a little trouble doing her interview, which hasn't been published yet because of, the Wi-Fi access is very limited out there, which makes you think, wow, we could be improving that instead of building a data center. She told me when we started talking about how much she uses AI every day in her job. And she actually works in the IT sector. She uses it many times a day. She's like, this technology makes me way more efficient and I love it. And I was like, do I have the right person? Like, didn't you say you started the Facebook group in your small town that eventually built a coalition and like stopped the data center? She was like, oh yeah, of course that was me. And I said, I'm not saying it doesn't make sense, but I don't understand. So walk me through it. And she was like, well, it's one thing to build an AI data center to power new technologies that could be used for benefits. It's another thing to roll over a community and say, we're going to build an AI data center in this small town across the street from thousands of residential homes, like basically the entire residential area of this small town in North Carolina. She's like, the reason we invented zoning in this country was so that people weren't living on top of coal plants anymore. And it's been good and bad, but like we know this. And what these data centers are doing is saying, well, we're not neatly in the category of commercial and industrial. So we can kind of say we just have a bunch of computers and then build wherever we want. She was like, absolutely not. So she started a Facebook group and started organizing her neighbors, and all the while maintained like, I love using AI. It's essential to my work. Like I love technology, and like this project is garbage and I don't want it to happen. And she also told me about the coalition. It was her, a school teacher. Let me see if I can remember everyone. It was an IT person who I talked to, a school teacher, and then a woman whose son is autistic and has done a lot of advocacy at the state house and local government for disability access and stuff, and maybe one or two other retired folks. I mean, just an amazing all-American story from someone who started it, who uses the technology every day. So those are some of the things that they get me really interested, not only as an organizer, but as someone who is interested in like narrative and how the world goes around. I've been bamboozled like every other day by what people have to say.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating too, because it would also be my assumption that a lot of the people kind of taking the lead on a lot of these projects are like organizing projects are the kinds of people who are like, I hate AI, I don't ever want to interact with it, I try to turn it off on all my devices. And it really sort of like, it also undermines this sort of narrative that we're starting to see coming out of the big data companies, who are starting to spin some counter narratives, right, to the things that are coming out of communities, and who are sort of pointing the finger back at folks, whether it's like, this is something that we need, you guys are enemies of progress, or even like being like, oh, well, like your regular internet usage uses X or Y amount of power, like why are you complaining about this? I'm curious if you're seeing some evolution in how folks are thinking about and interacting with that counterspin coming out of big tech.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest arguments that's coming from the AI companies and big tech generally, all of them brand themselves as AI companies now, I guess, is that they say it's inevitable. They're basically like, this is coming. We are going to have unlimited of this AI in everything that we do, and it's going to control every aspect of your life. So there's no point. Well, people have been saying for many months, like, first of all, I'm going to slow that down because I don't accept that. But people are also starting to develop really robust arguments about why it's not inevitable. And there's considerable economic evidence that companies who have laid people off and then tried to use AI instead have had huge failures. There's evidence that when workers are forced to train AI to do what they do and then they get fired, the AI systems fail to produce the same results. So from a purely, in a profoundly capitalist country, we're seeing that the capitalism of it all is not working out very well for AI replacing jobs. and being used in everything, it's actually in a lot of cases been a huge waste of money. I mean, what an embarrassment it was when Mark Zuckerberg had to cancel his little, like, what was it, chatbots communicating with each other, and he thought people were going to go on and watch. And it's like, well, most of us don't have as distorted and problematic of brains as you do, and you actually have things to do. So people are starting to make those connections and say, not only are we going to slow this down, but your own people are starting to quietly break the inevitability argument. And so we're going to point back in that direction and say, this isn't necessary at all. And I also think that as good organizers are wont to do, people are drawing historical parallels. They're saying, well, when the railroads were first built, people said this is the only way that we're going to travel, and there's going to be a huge expense on this. And then highways came in and replaced a lot of what used to be passenger rail, which was, in my opinion, a very tragic thing that happened. But people are tracing back to history and realizing, wow, this inevitability thing is actually just a marketing gambit, so that because they're upset about what we're doing.
Yeah, I think also about the way in which, I guess, like the Amazon model of like, we're going to make stuff free or cheap so that our thing becomes ubiquitous, and then like jack up the prices and like undercut small entrepreneurs who are using our platform, like that sort of, like, what Cory Doctorow calls in shitification. That like that dynamic also feels like it's playing out in sort of like hyperspeed right now with these AI products as well, where like it feels like it was just 6 or 9 months ago that like people were like, oh, it's so cheap, and now suddenly we're in the token apocalypse allegedly, and like companies' expenses around AI usage have ballooned in a way that doesn't seem sustainable either. So
Right. Well, that's true. And the other thing to note is that there's been a lot more reporting and evidence and awareness among the public recently that these AI data centers aren't even necessary for people to be able to use ChatGPT.
right.
A lot of them are housing people's personal data. They're housing military information about wars abroad that no one wants to participate in. They're housing, AI models that are being trained to do all kinds of surveillance and other things that people actually don't really want. So not only are people saying this inevitability thing is fake, just look at history, they're also saying, like, inevitability for what? You guys are trying to say this is inevitable. And part of what you're arguing is inevitable is that, it's the lethal autonomous weapon systems that are being trained to kill people in Iran and Lebanon without human intervention. I mean, this is something that the vast majority of Americans think is horrible. And, most people don't support this illegal and unnecessary war that's going on. But that's just one example of many of the things that are being housed and used as justifications to business leaders for data centers are actually bad.
Yeah.
It's not like all these data centers are being used to cure cancers and stuff. They only use that when they're doing marketing. Everything else is like our data, stolen languages, stolen New York Times articles that they've been running through over and over again. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, well, and I think that like when we really dig into this counterspin and we look at the sort of economics of a lot of the data center build out, it's like, who is actually the customer here? And to your point, I think that like we have been seeing so much over the last, really since the beginning of the year, the way in which big tech has really pointed to the fact that when the rest of the economy is kind of in the shitter, the biggest main customer for a product like this is ultimately the government. And in Trump 2.0, the government is the defense industry. This like huge defense spending bill that is like in excess of $1 trillion to wage these wars that nobody wants. It's like, that is, I can only imagine that folks who, business guys in Silicon Valley are seeing dollar signs. Like this is the only kind of like, in a lot of ways, the only customer left for the amount of data that these folks are collecting, which is terrifying.
It's really scary. One of the things that is really surprising about the AI data center stuff is the build out of AI data centers is revealing of what's possible in this country and what decisions our leaders are making. Because it's not just that people hate data centers. talked to so many people who are like, what they said they couldn't fund libraries. They said we couldn't have more parks, that would be an impossibility. These business leaders and government officials said that we couldn't have public transportation and high-speed rail in this country, and that we don't have enough money to save the rural hospitals closing because of Medicare cuts that were done to justify more military spending.
Yeah.
So people are looking at this and saying, wait a second, if I tick off the top 10 things that would help my life, school books for my kids who are in public schools, healthcare that I don't have to drive 45 minutes to get to. None of these things are being fulfilled by data centers. I mean, you really can't love a dark, locked up room with computers with war secrets in it. I mean, who likes that? It sucks and it's ugly. So people are like, yo, I would actually prefer a hiking trail, or I would prefer a movie theater.
Yeah.
You don't have to have like some ivory tower sophisticated analysis about like, where is this data really flowing to just be like, yo, this kind of blows.
The thing that this makes me think about is I recently, I even think it was yesterday, was listening to a podcast where Annalee Newitz was talking about the sort of anti-democratic features of AI. And Annalee's been on our show before and talking about some of the really thoughtful and hopeful speculative fiction work that they've been doing. But that, to your point, it's like one of the features of the data center boom and of AI in general is this almost authoritarian impulse towards, we want a centralized source of authoritative knowledge, and we don't actually want to ask people what they want. We're sort of scared of the fact that people know what they want. And I think the thing that you are finding through your conversations with everyday folks who are pushing back against data center buildouts is they're very comfortable actually articulating the things that they want. And in a lot of ways, I think each episode feels like a case in Annalee's point that like there is a thing about this that is fundamentally kind of authoritarian. And the flip side of that is a sort of like radical, vibrant, and resurgent democracy that is about communities reaching back towards self-determination and being in like real community with each other, even if that means like some conflict and some disagreement. And that feels incredibly hopeful to me in a time when it can be hard to see the seeds of a more robust democracy in this country.
Absolutely. I mean, the way that AI and AI data centers are threatening democracy is hard to even capture in one little, soundbite or something, because as you said, the threat overall is a like generational threat of the theft of language that has been developed by literally billions of people over thousands of years, have developed not just the English language, all the different languages that are being funneled into different AI systems. And then a few people saying we're so smart because we stole all of your data, your movement data, your language, your behavioral data from, tech companies and surveillance pricing systems. And now a small handful of people are trying to get exorbitantly wealthy with some success off of all this stuff that they stole.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea that it counts as permission or consent to sign some agreement form that's, 50,000 words long, where they say, in order to access this thing that you need, you have to give away your data, is preposterous. And so over the last few generations, they've been collecting and stealing data from basically every person in the world, forcing us to get addicted to these machines so their data sets can grow, and then selling it to the highest bidder. And I think if anything is undemocratic, it's stealing something from you and selling it back to you, and all of that being perfectly legal in our system.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening. When, let's say you, Caden, type something into ChatGPT, somewhere along its language training model, they probably stole an essay you wrote in college. Okay. And it's like, oh, this thing is so smart. You, as a member of our civilization, very broadly defined, contributed to this system. And now you're being asked to pay a monthly premium so that Elon Musk can make his little rockets. I mean, that is ridiculous.
Yeah.
And it's completely undemocratic.
I was going to say it's probably not an essay I wrote in college, but it's probably a screed that I wrote on Tumblr in like 2008.
Take your pick.
I've put so many thoughts on the internet for free that it's, it freaks me out. I try not to think about it too much because it definitely freaks me out. Well, that's great. So what is the plan for the show going forward? What do you have in the works? And where can folks find it?
We have some amazing interviews coming up. Everything from a music industry professional whose career is being heavily affected by AI and went on to lead a fight against data centers in Nashville. And another one that's coming up is an interview with a former senior person in the Biden administration about the relationship between trade networks and supply chains and organizing, and how organizers are starting to realize that there's one thing that's slowing down data centers more than protest and activism, and that's supply chains and tariffs and trade. And so people are starting to make that connection and say, what if our protests and organizing actually affected those supply chains? And so we're going to be talking about what those connections are with some really interesting folks. So lots of good stuff coming. Our next set of episodes is going to begin, the next 10 are going to begin on September 1st, I believe, early September in any case. And you can find The Hum on any platform. We work with Row Home Productions, who are wonderful podcasts and audio production folks who are, used to work at NPR producing shows. And so if you look up The Hum and Row Home on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or just about anywhere else, you can find it and take a listen and check it out and hear stories from people who are deeply involved in living and researching and writing about and fighting these battles for community control and community self-determination with the richest people in the history of the world.
Yeah, it's really good stuff. And I think that like adding texture and color to this sort of like narrative trend of discontent is actually super important. And just like the amount of nuance, detail, and sort of strategic insight that comes out of those conversations and, your ability to frame those things is really, really helpful. It's super good work. And I'm glad you're doing it.
Thanks so much. Thanks for listening. And yeah, really excited to be in conversation with you. I mean, I think we have a shared project of saying the best ways for organizers to improve our craft and build generational power with far less resources is to learn from people who are doing it well. And so that's what we're trying to do, is amplify those voices who maybe aren't going to get a spotlight in the Washington Post, but are doing really transformative work with limited money and resources.
Yeah, love it. Well, thanks so much for making the time to chat, Saul. It's always good to talk to you.
Pleasure was mine. Thanks, Caden. Talk to you soon.
My thanks again to Saul for joining me this week. You can find The Hum wherever you listen to podcasts. We also recently published a piece from Saul on our website called How Parallel Institutions Challenge Authoritarianism. You'll find links for both below. This show is published by Convergence, a magazine for radical insights. I'm Caden Mock, and our producer is Josh Elstrom. Kimmy David designed our cover art. Our summer intern, Trey Nitza, is back to school for the fall. Thanks for all your help this summer, Trey, and good luck with your junior year. Convergence Magazine is a proud founding member of the Movement Media Alliance. If you've got a second to support the show, please take a moment to rate and review the pod on whatever podcast platform you are listening on. This helps us find new listeners, and plus, I love reading your feedback. If you have a little more time, share this episode with someone you think will enjoy it. Nothing hits quite like a personal human-to-human recommendation. And of course, if Convergence and this podcast have improved your life in any way, and you'd like to keep us going, you can become a member at convergencemag.com/membership. Even a few bucks a month goes a long way to making sure our independent small team can continue to build this map for our movements. I hope this helps.